Hello. No, it's on. I'll just send you the details. I'll send you. Hmm.
I had to search all over and then get Anirudh to send me the link because it seems it came on the WhatsApp and it didn't come in the mail. So some people may not be able to join because of that.
WhatsApp, I know. I've sent it on mail also, Dr. Murthy.
You have to
No, I
register,
just
Dr.
checked.
Murthy.
You have to
No, I
register for. We are waiting for Dr. Ratna Devi hasn't joined.
Hi, Mehul.
Good evening, Dr. Rao.
Hello, Dr. Rao. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good.
I'm in Boston.
Boston, actually, you won't believe we have had so much rain
Yeah,
that we need to export it to California.
great. Don't export here. We have enough of our.
I know. It's just been a lot, very wet, the highest recorded rain ever in this month. But going well. Lots of interesting things happening in ophthalmology also now.
Yeah.
Dr. Raja, should we start?
Yeah, start off, Nadia. Go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion on patients as partners in clinical research and health policy. This is the first public engagement activity for IHOPE. Indian Health Outcomes Public Health and Economics Research Center, IHOPE, is a collaborative and interdisciplinary research center that has been set up with a research grant from the Wellcome Trust, DVT India Alliance, through collaborations between the LV Prasad Eye Institute, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Indian Institute of Public Health, Hyderabad. The key focus of the center is big data analysis, health economics, clinical and public health research in eye health. I am Arnaz Dalal, and I'm the project lead at IHOPE, and I'll be one of the moderators for this evening. Over to you, Panari.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Ponnari Gottipati. I'm a trained molecular biologist turned research management and outreach consultant based in Hyderabad. I work as a consultant grants manager at LV Prasad Eye Institute, and I'm also part of the IHOPE team. I'm delighted to be on this panel discussion today on such an interesting and important topic. Why we want to have this meeting, have this discussion is because the unique perspectives afforded by patients' lived experiences can inform researchers' approaches and identify knowledge gaps. By sharing their experience of daily burden of disease and their perspective regarding unmet needs, therapeutic burdens, the balance of benefit and risk, and the types of research questions most important to them, patient partners can transform the clinical development process from one directed by sponsors and investigators to one driven by the needs of patients and caregivers. So we feel that this is a very important topic that needs discussion, and therefore, we have with us eminent panelists who have contributed immensely to healthcare and research in their own unique ways. And I'm delighted to be in company of these eminent panelists. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tarjani Deb. She is the oculoplasty surgeon at LV Prasad Eye Institution and heads the ocularistry lab at LVPEI. For non-medical people, this translates to the lab that does prosthetic eyes. This particular laboratory at LVPEI has brought in many innovations to India, including the 3D printed customized implants for management of orbitofacial fractures. An accomplished academician, Dr. Dev has authored more than 60 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters. She's a passionate teacher and lectures widely on a range of topics related to orbital, facial, and socket surgery. And during the pandemic, she's been doing the important work of treating the patients of mucormycosis in Hyderabad. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Tarjini. We also have with us Professor GVS Murthy. It's my honor to welcome you to the panel, Professor Murthy. He's a director at the Indian Institute of Public Health, both Hyderabad and Bengaluru campuses. He's also the co-principal investigator at iHope, which is hosting the discussion today. He's an international expert on public health disability and has been engaged in generating evidence on healthcare access and health concerns of persons with disability and in developing innovative interventions to dismantle these barriers. He has about 300 publications to his credit, and he has undertaken research in countries like India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, to name a few. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Murthy. Arnaz, can I please request you to introduce the other two panelists and kick off the discussion?
Sure, thank you. I would now like to welcome Dr. Ratna Devi, who is the CEO and co-founder of Dakshama Health and Education, an organization that is dedicated to working for access to health, patient education, and advocacy. She leads a cross-disease patient alliance in India called the India Alliance of Patient Groups, IAPG. She's also the board member for Healthy India Alliance, the National NCD Alliance in India, and the Indian Organization for Rare Diseases. Welcome to the panel discussion, Dr. Ratna Devi. A pleasure to have you here. I would now like to move on to Dr. Mehul Mehta and welcome him to the panel. He is the Chief Medical Officer at Albright Stonebridge Group and leads the firm's health practice. He's also a member of the Department of Ophthalmology at the Harvard Medical School, where he has been since 1997. He's a key collaborator for the iHope project. Welcome to all the panelists. And with this, I would like to start off with Dr. Tarjini. I would like to ask the first question to you. Due to the larger number of clinical trials happening, especially in the post-COVID world, what are the apprehensions that patients have about these trials? What should the provider do to allay these apprehensions and fears? If you can give us a perspective from the recent mucormycosis black fungus scare amongst patients, that will be great. Over to you, Dr. Tarjini.
Thank you, Arnaz and Ponari, for the introduction, as well as having me as a part of this webinar. So moving straight on to your question, Arnaz. So the first part I understand was to sort of bring out what are the apprehensions that patients have with an increase in the number of trials that are happening. And one of the major things, and let me talk in perspective to the black fungus or the mucormycosis infection that you pointed out too. One of the major concerns, since this is an infection we are seeing increasingly in patients who've suffered from COVID-19, the major concern remains if it is contagious. So when we had patients, come into the OPD, we've had situations where patients have asked us that, doctor, have you examined another black fungus patient? Am I likely to get the infection from you, sort of a thing? So that is one of the concerns that is there. And one another issue that also happened was related to the drugs that are used or the medications that are used in the management of black fungus, where again, it's a very toxic medication to other body systems, but if not given in appropriate doses, can actually sort of, take the patient downhill. So that was one another fear that patients had with the use of the drugs that are recommended for treatment of black fungus. So what are the ways we can deal with these was your second question, or allay their fears. So as far as, the infection being contagious is concerned, it's very important that everybody on the team that is treating the patients conveys the right message that, no, this is not something that is contagious and cannot go from one patient to the other. And along with this, you bring in your entire gamut of social media as well as advocacy that you do, and get involved in policies that the government makes for management of these diseases. Black fungus was sort of made a notifiable disease by the government. So you sort of get involved at all those levels and reach out through print as well as other media to patients to tell them that, no, this is not something that is contagious. Now, as far as the medication part is concerned, that was also a concern for patients. These medications are toxic. They affect the kidneys and the other organ systems. And so what you need to also do is collaborate with other specialties and put your patient in a confident position and tell them that even if there are side effects that come out of these medications, we are a team and we'd still be able to manage it. So I think that is how it goes for your question, Arnaz. I hope I answered it.
Thank you. Thank
you. Dr. Ratna Devi, if I can change gears slightly here and ask the next question to you. So clinical trials are usually, they are designed keeping in mind the sponsor's interests and also the, the sponsor's ease with which the feasibility and the ease with which they can conduct the trial. So this could result in a large number of trials that could be very complex, very costly, but they may not necessarily meet patient needs, or they may not necessarily even keep patients' conveniences in mind. So could you tell us how involving patients in the process of the clinical trial can actually help design a better trial? And also, take us through the various steps in a clinical trial where patient voices can be involved.
Thank you, Ponari and Arnaz, for inviting me for today's discussion, and thank you to the organizers. This is a topic very close to my heart. So apart from the work that I do in India, I also wear a hat of being the chair of the Board of Trustees of International Alliance of Patient Organizations. That's a UK-based charity. And in many geographies, patient participation in clinical trials is very proactive and right from the design stage. But in countries like India, it is usually passive, where patients are enrolled by maybe the investigator or the sponsoring agency, as you just mentioned. So all they are told about is that there is something that might, give them better relief than the current treatment protocols that are being followed, or maybe their condition doesn't have a treatment protocol, and they are given hope that, there might be something that might work for them, and therefore that is the incentive by which they get enrolled into a trial. They usually do not know what has gone into the trial, why is that trial taking place, what are the processes involved in it, what are the outcomes of that particular trial, whether the trial is successful or not, is that communicated to that patient who is participating in it. None of this information is sought after by the patients themselves because they are not aware, or is it shared in the context of our country, because that kind of environment is currently not existing. So in terms of why is it important? Because patients are the ones who can actually give great insights into how the drug is working, whether they are getting the kind of responses that make them comfortable. So it's not just the clinical outcomes that one is looking at, but also patient-reported outcomes and real-world evidence on whether in the long term the patient is comfortable, continuing with that particular medication. And as Dr. Dave recently mentioned, there are a lot of side effects and sometimes very serious toxic effects to some medications. So if this person is not told about all this right from the beginning, in all possibility, even if the trial is successful, the medication will not be popular with the patients. So are these nuances explained to the patients when they actually participate in a trial? In terms of what are the different steps that a person can actually be participative, as I said, the first step is, of course, as a research participant, where they contribute either their experiences or their knowledge or some biological specimen to a trial. The second, of course, is an insight provider, and this comes from the terminology called an expert patient, which is a very common terminology that is used in many countries. And these are people who have lived experience for a very long time and have actually gone through a lot of literature, have researched about their condition and know exactly what is working and what is not working for them. And this might be outside a clinical protocol or a treatment protocol that is there in our medical textbooks. But it doesn't describe what the patient actually is feeling or experiencing. And this kind of insight could be very, very useful to a trial. The third, of course, is an advisor, where they are a level above the insight provider. So if you look at doctors who become, trial participants, or other professional people who become trial participants, because they have this educational insights as well, they are able to analyze what is happening to them, and they are able to give scientific data and knowledge. Then they can also become reviewers. So it could be scientific journals, scientific articles, the dossiers themselves, or even the protocols that are designed right at the beginning. They could be co-designers. So there are many patient groups now that do crowdfunding to actually design their own clinical trials, because those trials have small participation and therefore they are not commercially viable, or many companies would not be interested in it. And they have a family member who they want a cure for. So they do the crowdfunding and they start their own trials. And of course, then they become the driving force. So usually clinical trials are, the research question that drives the clinical trial is actually because somebody sees a commercial viability in it. But if there is no commercial viability, will it still be something that people are interested in? And how can the patient community then influence that decision making? So if there is a very large patient community or a large patient group that's actually demanding that there should be some treatment that's available to them, then they become a driving force that influences policy as well as the sponsors. So I'll stop there, because I remember it was just 2 minutes for each participant. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ratna Devi. My question now is to Dr. Murthy. Dr. Murthy, enrollment in trials is generally led by clinicians who are in a tertiary hospital. The information about the trial is rarely available to the general population. There is no awareness amongst patients for them to even know that they qualify for the trial. So in these given circumstances, how can patient awareness be augmented to ensure we empower them to have a say in the entire process whilst conducting trials? How can systems be put in place to ensure that selection of people is more comprehensive and not biased towards cities? In general, basically, the question is, how do we increase patient access to clinical research?
Right, Arna, I think that's a very important question. The reasons that you just mentioned, there are certain contextual factors which make it more amenable for collecting people from an urban area. One of the basic reasons is that the density of populations in the urban area is big. Complementing that factor is a thing that hardly anybody in specialties like ophthalmology or oncology or rheumatology would be available in the rural areas. And therefore, they tend to try and take the patients from the base that they have in the bigger hospital setups in the urban areas. So that is a pragmatic reason why that happens. But having said that, it's not entirely true that rural populations do not get represented. One of the major reasons is the nature of the query. So if the question, the research question that is being asked is more about treatment, and if that is only available at a specialty hospital, then obviously there would be a bias towards the urban-centric patients. But if you look at examples like community water supplies and the role with conjunctivitis or trachoma, does household connection make a difference compared to a well or a pond in the village? Now, that sort of a research has been done in the rural areas. Similarly, if you're looking at something like spectacle acceptance and coverage and utilization by rural school children, especially girls, and that would happen in a rural area. So it's basically, one of the reasons is that the nature of the research questions that are asked are more in favor of having participants from an urban area. Also look at the costs in terms of transporting people if you have to get them from long distances. That also leads to a lot of fallout, and that is also going to affect the results of the research. So there are a number of reasons, but one of the best ways in which we need to try and get more people is that, mass media, pamphlets, they would never work. What you need is interpersonal channels of communication. That is the only way. And one of the things that research teams can invest in is to have a facilitator whose prime responsibility is to go meet people, explain to them, and in fact, like Ratnaji mentioned, if it is done even at the conceptualization phase, that is even better. But otherwise, trying to have this base of facilitators who then explain to people in small group discussions or in individual interpersonal channels, that would be helpful. The other system enablement that would be required is when we have these committees like the ethics committee or the data monitoring committees, it's good to have civil society representatives on these committees. Maybe we could fix something like 20% or 25% of the monitoring committees should consist of civil society representatives. Similarly for the ethics committees. And these sort of things actually make a big difference in getting the voices of people heard, and to see that any adverse effects that they are faced with are actually looked at much more carefully than when they are not available there. So the systems can be strengthened and should be strengthened to actually improve participation of the civil society, which would be a broader umbrella of people who would finally participate in the trials or other clinical research. Back to you, Arnaz.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. If I can bring you into the discussion now, Dr. Mehul. Dr. Ratna Devi mentioned patient-reported outcomes. And I've also heard that there are certain institutions like the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute in the USA and the James Lind Alliance in the UK, which are trying to come up with these outlining the differences between patient priorities versus, a clinician priorities for research. So building on what Dr. Ratna Devi spoke about previously, so why do you think, how can considering patient priorities contribute to more efficient clinical research? And why is patient involvement crucial in identifying the questions to ask and also the outcomes to assess? And from your own experience in USA, can you tell us what the regulatory bodies are doing to make sure that patient voices are included in the research study design?
Sure. So I think what you raise is actually an evolution and realization we have that who is the ultimate beneficiary of the research? Why does research occur when you look at therapeutic research, and who benefits? And ultimately, it's the patient. And we've started to move our thinking in healthcare to look at patient-centric healthcare. Patient-centric healthcare, the basic premise is that the entire care is about the patient with the patient involved. Now, if you are doing healthcare that's patient-centric, the care we are delivering is rooted in the research that we do that says that that care has efficacious results. So that is where the root of patient centricity in research comes in. And why is it important is that at the end of the day, functional outcomes and what matters to patients really matters, because that's what's really going to change the way patients will benefit from care. It's not about a single lab value that makes a difference. So I'll give you one classic example of, we've seen this occur time and again, by the way. This is part of what I call the larger sort of challenges in clinical research structure, including the point that Dr. Murthy raised about bias. That's also structured in. Now, if you look at common diseases, look at diabetes, does the patient care whether the A1C is under 6 or at 8? We care as clinicians because we know the A1C is a biomarker to pathogenic change. Patient cares whether they're going to go blind. Patient cares whether they're going to have renal dysfunction. Patient cares about their quality of life, how many times insulin needs to be taken. How is that factored in? Now, if you don't factor that into any new form of therapy, if you don't factor that in, then really you haven't impacted quality of life for patients. A classic study done years ago, which I had publicly criticized, much to my detriment because I was a fellow at that time, was a study done on vitamin A. vitamin A in retinitis pigmentosa, high doses of vitamin A was found to actually reduce the measured changes in the ERG. The ERG changes reduction over time became slower. There was no correlate with functional outcome. Did the patient actually reduce the rate of vision loss? Was not correlated. And everybody started to give high doses of vitamin A. Now, vitamin A is fat soluble. It has its own vitamin A toxicity issues. Nobody looked at vitamin A toxicity cumulative over time. Now, this came from a very, very famous center in the US, which I'll not name, with a very famous person. But my simple issue at that stage was, what is the correlate to functional change in retinitis pigmentosa? So the basis of having patients involved is that you hear the voice of the final beneficiary of this. And this has to come, as Dr. Ratna Devi said, not only that should they understand what is the consequence of research, but they have to come to research design. So what's happening in the United States is that this is a UK set of initiatives that you mentioned. Even in the United States, is patient voices are becoming extremely powerful in research design and research initiation. We would have never had the Avastin trial had patients not said that Lucentis is too expensive. We want to have, why would they invest in Avastin trial? Nobody invested in it. The government invested in it. In effect, the community invested in it. And that's when Avastin and Lucentis went head to head to show efficacy. But patients said, this is too expensive. A whole section of patients said, if that patient voice is not there, you lose on many things. You lose on efficacy. You lose on economics of trial. You lose on actually benefit to the health system. And you lose on what is the ultimate mission of any therapeutic intervention, is to benefit patients. Now you asked me one question about what are the actual measurable benefits. Data that we collect in clinical trials is absolutely essential, because that is going to impact how the analysis is done. There's an 80% data reduction need to get to the outcome. What is your objective outcome of a trial? If you include patients in them, you get much more relevant data. You could have never got vaccine complication data had patients not been involved directly and given that data in, right? So patient-reported outcomes is, to me, fundamental, is sine qua non. But I'm saying patients in design and patients in initiation of trial. Now, there are a lot of examples of that, but I'll stop here. And that is what I think the government is trying to push in regulation. It's not there. Lots of trials are not happening. But United States government regulatory authorities have realized that this is actually a much better outcome for the health system as a whole when you involve patients.
Thank you, Dr. Mehun. Dr. Tarjini, in the face of travel restrictions due to COVID, participants' fears and the desire to keep patients and staff safe, how does the research keep going? Keep going on, and what are the new measures and steps that are being taken or have been put in place to continue the important work in this direction?
Yeah, thank you, Arnaz, for that question. So I'd like to answer it in three parts. So when you want to continue research, you need to make sure that your procedure is safe, your hospital is safe, and the travel for the patient is safe when we're talking about pandemic-induced restrictions. So how do you make your procedures safe so that you can still continue to do research? So you need to make sure that in the presence of the pandemic and patients getting infected from other patients, you have put in practices where sanitation is done well. The patient, you do not have too much of rush as far as the patient's procedure is concerned. You're using all sorts of antiseptics that have been recommended, and you have put the patient on appropriate prophylaxis if it is required. So that's as far as your procedure is concerned. Now, when you look at making the hospital safe, there are several other issues that come in. The staff who work at the hospital, the doctor himself, the patient, all of these need to get screened for basic tests to know whether they are infected with the virus or not. And you need to have a basic level of sanitization in your hospital or institute so that it's a safe place where patients can walk in and still get their treatment in the face of the pandemic. And the last part is about the travel. Now, this is something that is difficult for us to make it safe for the patient so that the research continues. But there are certain contingencies, like, say, for example, if, we had this discussion about data, which is the most important aspect as far as research is concerned. So if you need data, could you look at getting teleconsults for the patient and performing online consults and getting accurate data via those kind of platforms? That could be one. Could you look at patients having tests done locally close to their home and then uploading those reports for you to still be able to capture that data? So these kind of contingencies at these three levels of making the procedure, the hospital, and the travel safe for the patient might still be able to get you the data that you require as far as your research study is concerned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tarjini. Dr. Ratnadevi, if I can come back to you and continue the discussion, that you mentioned some of the points that you mentioned about, commercial viability versus, what is actually required by the patient and how patient voices can drive these kind of decisions. So basically, can you tell us how the gap between the people who need these services and the people who provide these services can be reduced? And what is the ground reality in the country and in India especially, and are patient voices being patient groups involved in decision making in terms of what kind of research takes place in the country? And also, I mean, if I want to participate in a trial in India, then is there a registry or is there a database of all the trials that happen? How do I even find out what research is going on in the country?
Thank you, Ponari. So those are three questions, and I'll try to answer each one of them. And start with the last. In terms of whether there is information that's publicly available, there is a clinical trial registry, but it's extremely difficult to navigate for a layperson. And you do get a lot of information in that, but whether that information is transferable and understandable, decipherable by a layperson to be able to understand whether they can go to that particular institute and enroll themselves or not is extremely difficult. So there needs to be a translated, simpler version which is easily accessible to patients and patient groups so that people who are interested can enroll. And in many countries like the US and other countries, it's actually publicly advertised. And you can go to an enrollment center, and if you qualify, then you can fill out forms and you can participate in those trials. But that kind of incentivization or that kind of information sharing is still not available in our country. In terms of whether clinical trials participation involves patients, it is just starting. In some areas, yes, it does. But we have to understand the landscape of the country. Most of the trials are not by domestic pharma industry, or domestic pharma doesn't involve patients as much as the multinationals do. So the culture of involving patients and patient groups is more a concept that's coming from the West. It is still not imbibed so much within the country. So if you see the large pharmaceutical groups that are domestic, they do support patient groups for events and for a little bit of advocacy, but they don't involve them in other aspects of the patient journey. So I think that needs to change if the research design has to be contributed from the patient side. In many other multinational trials, patients are involved at various stages. But again, that depends on what kind of trial it is and whether patients, it is possible that if there is a international federation of the same patient group, then participants from the International Federation have participated, and they are taken as a proxy to the voice of the patient in India as well. Though the context may be different and the geographical and cultural conditions might be different. But that's how it works, because it's difficult to involve patients from every geographic area. But there are many companies now who are making a conscious attempt to try and pick as many participants as possible, even in the design phase. In terms of whether people are able to actually drive such trials in the country, we do not have investments. In many countries, it's the government or the academic institutions that also drive trials. It's not just the pharmaceutical companies that do it. But again, that kind of environment is still picking up in our country. So when there is larger investment in this kind of scientific research, I think the landscape will become better for patient groups to participate. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Ratna Devi. I'll now talk, ask Dr. Mehul. Then in the West, when we were talking about rare diseases and patient groups being the driving force there, they, through crowdfunding, they're able to design the research process. They're also finding the right experts to drive the research process and find new and innovative methods to do that, to treat these rare diseases. So, however, in India, we obviously, as even Dr. Ratna Devi said, that we find that lacking. So why do you think that is lacking? And, what are the barriers, and how do you think vis-a-vis the West, can we bring about some change here?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. I'll tell you that in the West also, nothing has really, it's moved, but it is a long way to go. And there are certain places that have done a great job. I'll give you one example, which I think is an exemplar, is the cystic fibrosis group. So if you see cystic fibrosis, very motivated group, they formed the Cystic Fibrosis Society, is a very powerful representation of the group. Let's look at this an example and then see what the gaps are with India and where I think you can fill. So what is the story of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation? Huge patient advocacy, but then they also decided that, if we don't take our treatment in our own hands, we will never see a breakthrough. We are a subgroup, large pharma is not really interested. And they then funded basic science research. Funded basic science research in the pathogenesis of cystic fibrosis. They found the effector proteins, and the basic science teams found the blockers. They then took the IP, and then they licensed the IP for drug development. That resulted in a blockbuster drug. The Cystic Fibrosis Society today is a great example of drug development by patient advocacy. So if you go upstream, this is the level it went upstream. And today the Cystic Fibrosis Society as a society is extremely affluent just by the license revenue of the drug, because it has actually made cystic fibrosis not a death penalty. People live with it because you can block the condition. Now, where did that start from? It started from a very educated, motivated, and powerful advocacy group of patients. That means that you start with patient education. And that means that you have to give education, empowerment, and with empowerment have a voice that they can influence and not be influenced by treatment. It starts by the basics. Had the cystic fibrosis, I think Dr. Ratna Devi mentioned, you have what is called a very advanced patient here. You have to have patient education as the foundation for any patient involvement. Currently, and as somebody's put on the post, there is a perception that clinical trials is really an experimentation. Many people have that in their mind, that they're experimenting on us, and that's actually we are guinea pigs. That mindset starts you at a negative place. How can you advocate when you think you're being experimented on? It's really about patients, especially those who don't have treatment, those who have big gaps in treatment. They're very motivated groups. It has to start with education, then it has to start with empowerment, and then it has to start with a platform for advocacy. And the platform for advocacy is not about just policy, but it's engaging the industry that can do discovery, and then guiding them in terms of what sort of discovery that needs to be made, which also means money, which also means funding. And all this is really the basic template. It's the basic roadmap to creating greater patient involvement. I'll just leave you with this one example, which is now in the press all over in the world, coming out of Biogen in the US because of their drug for Alzheimer's, that if you look at it from the neuroscience perspective, there's a lot of skepticism because it takes the amyloid path, but there's nothing there in Alzheimer's. And patient advocacy groups have said, we want this drug. And it is under that pressure that the FDA approved it for a narrow application. It's created a huge amount of controversy, no question about it. But this is advocacy-driven outcome.
Thank you, Dr. Mehul. That's very interesting. So taking a step back from there, Dr. Murthy, if I can ask you, so Dr. Mehul mentioned about increasing, patient knowledge and educating patients and creating these patient experts. But even before that, like, one of the, like Prem Nandini has mentioned in the comments and which Dr. Mehul has also talked about, there is a general, the general public in India is not really familiar with research at all. And whatever familiarity they have also is focused on negativity, which leads to a perception of suspicion and fear. So what do you think can be done to normalize society's image of research, and how do we build trust among general public on research in general?
Right. Again, a very important concern when we look at participants in any research design. And I'd say that this is not just a trial, but any type of research, even an observational research study is also equally important. And therefore, when you look at something like a survey design and you talk about no surveys without service, that actually increases the interest in the community that, okay, they're doing something, but they're also providing us a service in lieu of the research that is being done. And that is a very strong mechanism to actually get them involved. Again, looking at observational studies, in the surveys that we have done and a large number of groups have done in India, at the moment, we don't involve them in the conceptualization. That is something that is the next stage and must happen. But when you actually go to a village or a cluster, you always first go to the head of the village, whether it is in Nigeria or India, and without their acceptance and getting a complete know-how of what you're proposing to do, they actually do not allow you to go in and do that. So that is a group of people who can be talked to, whether it is a trial or whether it's an observational study, get them engaged. But that engagement to build trust has to be done with transparency. If there is no transparency and if you're trying to fudge the information sheets on later on the numbers and the outputs, then there is always going to be cynicism in the community that you've just used them. The other thing that also is important when you look at the patient education or participant education is the fact that when you have them on board during the implementation of the research, it is equally important to have them on board after the research has concluded. Many a time, we don't provide them any feedback and we don't provide them the services which may be required in a 3 to 6 month window. So when we are looking at funding research, we also must keep in mind that it does not end with the data collection as far as the patient journey or participant journey goes. We have ethical and moral responsibilities that go beyond that. If we start in this manner, we will slowly get a foothold in the community and they would be participant ambassadors who can actually drive the interests of the rest of the community. Having said that, if you look at any community, there would always be 10% who would never accept anything, but the remaining 80 to 90%, you can work with them. It means you spend more time with that 10%, but you are able to continue to work because you've won the confidence of the 80 or 90% in the population. And that is important as a dynamic when we do research. Also remember that many of the formulations that you use, even in a survey, can have some adverse effects, maybe transient. So we have this big refractive error study in children. So one girl in one of the slums in Delhi, a young girl, she immediately had extrapyramidal symptoms and the entire family was scared, and it was just the 10th day of the study. If we had not done something, then that would have been the end. So what we did was that we had 3 of the research staff stay at that house with that child and the family throughout the night because we knew that it would pass off the next morning. And that actually got us more numbers to come in. So you have to stand there and say, look, I'm there for you. If anything happens, I take care. And that is the best form of awareness. The ambassadors and providing the helping hand when things do not go well, as well as the services, awareness automatically starts increasing over a period of time. Back to you, Pannari.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. So now I'll ask my next question to Dr. Ratna Devi. Dr. Ratna, what do you think incentivizing patients, will it help with increasing their participation in trials? The reason I ask this question is because we've been told by clinicians in India that incentivizing patients is seen with a lot of suspicion. So what are the ethical dilemmas involved over here? And also, can you shed some light on the importance of patient participation in the institutional regulatory approval process?
Thank you, Naz, and an extremely important question again, because this is a thorny issue, and there are lots of people who believe strongly that incentivization increases participation, and an equal number of people who think that it adversely influences the choice and the enrollment. So I'll try and split the incentivization into monetary, non-monetary. So if you are providing some kind of incentive because a person has to travel, there is loss of wages, and you're compensating for the time, that I think is ethical, incentivization, and is not really influencing adversely as long as the whole process is explained properly and formal, consent, etc. is taken. But if there is adverse influence in terms of, using coercive measures, and if there are other treatments being provided apart from the trial, and there are terms and conditions that if the person doesn't participate, then they might lose other benefits, etc., then those kind of incentives might be detrimental, and you might lose people midway to the trial, or there would be a high dropout of that particular trial. Then there would also be a question of undue inducement. So considering that a lot of people in our country are very poor, small amounts of money also mean a lot to them. And even though the amount as far as the trial is considered may be very small, it might influence the decision of the patient to enroll into the trial. And considering that literacy is also a very big problem, even though all the pros and cons have been explained, the person might not have understood the pros and cons and might have enrolled just because there is a monetary incentive. So how do you overcome this and really ensure that the monetary part of it is not influencing the enrollment into the trial? And that's a difficult question to answer, but I think as Dr. Murthy mentioned, one has to become part of the community, sit with them and explain in their own language, and then try and see whether they are really willing to be part of the trial, and money is not the only issue that is driving them to be part of the trial. And then, of course, there's a question of unfair payment. So when you are even trying to give, incentives for payment for, say, travel or other expenses that the patient might incur because they have to participate in the trial, if there is a large geographic spread, how do you actually come to a common denominator of what is fair to the patient? So something that is fair to a person living in a rural area might not be fair to a person living in an urban area. How do you then bring a balance to say that every person who is participating gets a fair amount? And that's again a very difficult question to answer, because you have to arrive at some kind of common denominator and say, okay, this is the amount that will be given as reimbursement for every participant, even though that might not be actually supporting travel to, say, in a big metro, or for a person who's traveling long distances. Then in terms of inducement, it could also be result in biased enrollment. So there could be certain patient groups or other agencies that have databases and offer, enrollment either free of cost or for some amount of money. And that would actually mean that there is a small set of patients from this group that are getting enrolled, and it is not getting the larger patient community into it. And how do you then, build in measures to see that this kind of biased enrollment does not happen? What was the last question that you asked me?
So this was about about the importance of patient participation in the institutional regulatory approval process.
Absolutely necessary. And I think Dr. Mehul Mehta mentioned this earlier. Every single IRB and ethics committee should have a patient voice in it. Currently, they do include a civil society voice or a not-for-profit organization voice, but I think it should become more specific, and it should include a patient voice, especially a patient with the lived experience of the same condition that the trial is conducting. I think it should go beyond just the IRBs and ethical institutes, and patients should become part of, say, HTA bodies, then, technical advisory groups and other institutional mechanisms that are there in the country where they can actually give their inputs to make the trials a better process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ratnadevi. So can I, if I can ask the last question to Tarjini before we open up the panel for questions from audience. So recruiting patients from different contexts and different backgrounds obviously will provide more relevant knowledge that, that is more suited for heterogeneous population probably, rather than recruiting it in, select sites. So how do you think, again, Dr. Murthy has slightly touched on this, but in your opinion, how do you think we can decentralize this process of recruitment, patient recruitment for clinical trials? Do you think, using technology like, telemedicine, could that help? Embedding clinical research into clinical practice at various levels, do you think would that help? If you can just share your views on that.
Yeah, thank you, Ponnari. So I do agree with the initial statements you made, and we all know that clinical trials are the cornerstone for evidence generation on which practice of medicine is based. But quite often we face difficulties with the number of patients that we can actually enroll. And primarily that is due to the travel to a particular place where they need to go, where the clinical research is being conducted. So decentralizing clinical trials is actually a great way to facilitate conducting studies outside the physical boundaries of traditional clinical research facilities. And they can extend the reach of clinical investigations to even the historically, underserved populations, while they enable incorporating tools such as digital health or telemedicine or artificial intelligence to a certain extent, or maybe remote monitoring of patients via drone devices that can be sort of manufactured and used. We have one such example where we have a drone slit lamp where the patient is actually physically at a distant location and you are at a different location, and you can still perform a clinical test and get the data that you require. However, there are certain things that need to be understood when you decentralize. You need to consider factors such as cybersecurity and data privacy protection laws need to be sort of taken into account before decentralization can be considered.
Thank you, Dr. Tarjini. I think we are running short on time, so I would like to open this up to the audience for asking their questions. Please feel free to unmute and ask the question, and let there be some interaction. As we have people coming on, I have one question here from Dr. Varsha Rathi. Dr. Varsha, if you're there, if you would like to ask the question. No. Okay, so I'll just ask, she's asked any specific criteria that should be looked into when we have patients participate in a study at the planning stage. And this does not necessarily need to be for a rare disease study. So can I request Dr. Murthy to take this question?
Right, Arnaz. I think we now need to think out of the box when we are looking at this particular issue. And one of the things that we can start doing is involve the patients who participated in research earlier or the community representatives in a research prioritization exercise at regular intervals. So the bigger institutions can actually start looking at, okay, let's call a group of people who have been or under treatment for diabetes, and let's ask them what they feel are the research priorities that we as an institution should spend time on. And I think that sort of a thing, if institutions start doing the research prioritization exercise using the community as a whole or those who participated in research earlier, like Dr. Mehul mentioned about cystic fibrosis, you can actually enlarge this because people would have a large number of problems. In addition to the community groups or the patients, you also have, say, the parents of ROP children. Now, they have experienced a lot of issues while they've been looking after their child, whether it is for screening or treatment. Now, they come with a lot of ideas in their mind that the medical sciences should find a solution to this. They also become part of that exercise for a research prioritization. I think if institutions start working on that, we may get very healthy data which can help drive the research agenda in the institutions. One more thing that I would personally say is that, at any point of time, there are about 10,000 to 15,000 students doing their MDs, MSs, the diplomates at fellowships, between 10 to 15,000 people. Now, if we start with institutions like LVP and the bigger institutions, that whenever you decide to identify a research topic, get somebody in that particular area, patients who've been treated earlier or voices of patients involved in framing the research question. The final say would be yours and the supervisors, the mentors, but involving them can actually make a difference, because we want to start building capacities in this sort of outside the box thinking right from the training stage itself, not when we are 40 plus or 50 plus. Let's start building these mechanisms right from that particular age itself. And this can actually make a big difference in trying to set criteria. Once the bigger institutions start, it can then become an overall policy that whenever you do your MD thesis, there should be a statement. Did you consult with these groups before that is accepted? So there are mechanisms which can be set in motion to try and make this happen, Arnaz.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. While we wait for other questions from the audience, Dr. Mehul, if I can ask you one last question. So when we're talking about involving patient voices in research, it is also equally important to make sure that, the ultimately research objectivity in research is also very, very important. So how do we maintain the balance, and how do we ensure that bias is avoided? If you can please comment on that.
Thank you, Punari, for asking that question. I had raised it. To me, the number one thing, if I had to ask people to according to me, when you're talking about patient involvement and doing a more objective trial, is to understand that bias is one of the things that has influenced every aspect of medicine. And we are living with the biases of treatment currently. If I told you that majority of the cardiovascular drugs given have been tested on white males, but they are given to females, and that too in India, how would you feel about it? If I tell you that the way whether we do a laparoscopic cholecystectomy depends a lot about who the patient is rather than the clinical indication for lap chole, and that's a big driver of lap chole indication, how would you feel about it? We have so much implicit bias in medicine, and that influences our care in ways that are borderline ethical. So what I'm trying to raise is two things. We in India are using Western-driven data that is intrinsically biased for our Indian population. We have to stop this. We have to get data that is relevant to our ethnic groups and our biophysiology, which we need to map first. I am on this sort of a bit of a tirade that we don't understand our ethnic genomics, and we are not one country. We are a big, diverse diaspora of genomic ethnicity. If we talk of gene therapy and all these wonderful things of switching on genes and switching off genes as future therapy, how are we going to do it if we don't understand what is our substrate? So we have to invest in India in getting our data for our own people and understanding what is the ethnic difference when a Gujarati female gets a coronary artery disease versus a Bengali male getting one. It's quite different. Ask the cardiac surgeons what they see. And yet we don't have, do we have an Asian heart study? We don't. Stanford had to set up an Asian Heart Center. You know that most of the vascular diseases coming in males in India, especially from the Western coast, are single vessel, long calcified occlusions of the LAD. Why is it that we don't have this? So then we should then say research, we have to start with the bias question. No research can be valid for a country if it is intrinsically biased. And this is something that government has to understand, and we as clinicians have to understand. With Tarjini, Dr. Dave is giving, this breakthrough drug Tepezza, which is a insulin growth factor receptor 1 inhibitor. Look at all the Tepezza studies. Now we'll come to India, we'll give it for thyroid eye disease. But most of the data that has been done on Western Caucasian populations. We'll ask patients to pay an arm and a leg for Tepezza. Is the responsiveness still the same? Are we getting the same expression of insulin growth factors in our patients? We don't know. So I think we are flying blind. And I think this is, if I have to leave from my perspective, my involvement, one message here is, let's get our own data for our own patients and do it in a structured and unbiased fashion. We are using too much of data that does not belong to our patients.
Thank you, Dr. Mehul. Actually, we are running short on time, but we'll take this last question from Aparna Mittal, who's from Patients Engage. She would like to ask a question to the panelists. This will be our last one.
Thanks, Arnaz. We talked of trust in the clinical trials from the patient perspective. But on the other hand, we often see that patient experiences are dismissed as anecdotes, or they're dismissed as in the mind. What are we going to do to make sure that future doctors, future researchers are more empathetic and listen better to patient voices? Because unless we are willing to listen to patients, we are not going to take their input seriously. So I don't know who should address this. I'll leave it open.
I can jump in and address if it helps you. What you said is so fundamental. And I'll come back to something right now, right? There was so much skepticism on the symptom presentation of COVID. And patients were actually talking about long-haul COVID, right? Do you know that most of the patients who had long-haul COVID were treated for mental health disease?
Yes.
And now we have suddenly realized, oh my God, there is this condition called long-haul COVID. And my God, this is dysautonomia going on. Now it so happened, and I'm going to connect with bias, because bias is a very important topic for me. Majority of the long-haul COVID patients with dysautonomia are females. Majority of how does dysautonomia present? It presents with tachycardia, high blood pressure, sweating. They all said you're getting a panic attack. Now, why is it when a female said your panic attack and when males started to get it, it started to be taken seriously? Answer the question for me. We don't listen to patient voices, and in our review of patient voices comes a bias filter.
Yeah.
And this is the problem in medicine. So you're absolutely right. We have to break that. If we don't break that, we won't get objective medicine. Forget talking of patient involvement in clinical design. Objectivity is lost in medicine, then the basics structure of science is lost.
So if I could just add to that, and because the other part of the question was the younger health professionals, how do we get them imbibe the spirit of patient participation? Extremely critical that, like I mentioned earlier, unless you start at the younger age in the formative period, you can't get them to change their habits later. And therefore, if the IRBs decide that 25% or 20% of the members would be from the participant groups or the patient groups or friends of patients, and that there is a good mix of male and female, younger, older, in that particular grouping, and each research that is done by the students includes them talking to these people to actually understand what their concerns are. And this has actually been done not in research, but in programmatic planning. So, in medical education, in some of the medical schools in India, I worked for about 4 years in Sevagram. The very first week that students join, they have a rural camp. The entire batch goes and spends 2 weeks in the village to understand how people live. And they use trench latrines, everything which is as much similar to what is available there. Now, by the time they come to the final year, they have a changed attitude. And I have seen students from some of these medical schools like Sevagram, from Vellore, they have a different perception compared to many other schools. So if you start at that stage, you start interacting and you're taking to the community, you will understand the community concerns far better than starting very late in life.
I'd just like to add a point to what Dr. Murthy said, and also what Dr. Mehta said. I mean, yes, there is a clinician bias, but I think also there is a policy and a regulator bias. And I think those are not young people. They are all very settled in life and very, very difficult to change their opinions. So I think we need a critical mass of patients as well to change those opinions and create some kind of an enabling environment within the country. And I think people like yourselves, Dr. Murthy, and there are so many other like-minded people who actually believe that the patient voice and the people who actually have a lived experience can contribute. And if those kind of spaces are opened up for these patient groups to participate more actively, I think the regulators and the policymakers will also start opening up to the idea of allowing patients into their discussion rooms. And that might gradually create an environment where there is more trust amongst the patient groups and the regulators and policymakers. Also, to your point, Dr. Mehta, in my work in patient advocacy in India, I've realized that the biggest challenge is from professional groups, professional clinician groups. The minute they see a patient group on a panel, they just dismiss the patient group saying, okay, they are, they're present to tick a box or to just listen to a story, but they don't take it very seriously. So how do you influence these professional groups to actually listen to the patient groups? I think that could be something that could be taken up actively if these biases have to be removed from the system.
Yeah, great points. Thank you all so much for a very, very passionate discussion on patient voice. I think we had some very good points which came about. It's about various aspects. It's about, as was mentioned, from the regulatory side, from the healthcare provider side, and also probably from the patient side. A lot of things need to change. The current system is about one drug going past the finish line. It's like having a race, a marathon. We have just one runner. And if the runner is able to go past the finish line, it's all approved. But it's real life is not like that. It was mentioned that clinical trials are kind of an artificial setting, as Dr. Mehta pointed out, so many biases. But the real world is very different, full of potholes. You have a test condition of a car and say it gives X mileage and also drives at so many miles an hour, but the real world is so different. Similarly, clinical trials are so different in the real world. And that's where we need to look at the current setting of approval process more in favor of an industry getting approval for the market. It's not about what's best for the patient. We need to evolve a system now. Things have changed in the last few decades that we are at a point that it's not about one drug. It's about doing what is best for the patient, especially the COVID pandemic has showed us that no single company could come up with a particular drug. It was actually dexamethasone, which was probably the most effective, and it was not a pharma-sponsored trial which showed that it was most effective in critically ill patients. So that's what we are looking at. And what does it show? What it means is that we are looking at patients as not patients. Some people who do not have a conflict of interest, they should help evolve systems and bring in a new era of clinical research. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank all the panelists, all the speakers, all the patients, all the audience, and also India Alliance, who spared their time today to share their thoughts with us. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.